Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here and letting me be here. I'd like to tell you the story of my never-to-be-released virtual reality particle simulation called Sire, how it began as a fun little 2-day prototype and how it ended up causing me 3 years of misery and anxiety through a series of terrible decisions and a lack of self-knowledge about creativity, and how that ultimately taught me a lot about myself as a creative person and generally how to sort of operate as a maker of interactive things. I am a developer, designer, sort of artisty person, working as a freelancer in Melbourne, primarily sort of in the arts and sort of festival creativity scene, almost exclusively in VR and AR. Okay, so to tell my story, I've got to start with sort of who I was in 2016 and where I was at. So at the time, I was working at Liminal, the startup that I was helping to set up, and during the day, I would sort of be working on little discrete, sort of satisfying projects one after another, and then I would come home in the evenings and I would make a whole bunch of really random, sort of fun, abstract, often generative, often musical, often sort of prototypes and experiments, none of which were ever intended to be released as products, so much as just, fun hobby projects that people who are creative like to make. And at the time, my sort of newest obsession was this sort of particle app that I was working on. It was originally a 2-day prototype that I'd worked on to sort of teach myself how to use compute shaders in Unity. But what it quickly sort of became was this really interesting game as a system where over the course of the sort of years I was working on it, putting people through the experience, I noticed that everyone kind of treats and operates in Sire differently. It's a physics application, doesn't really matter. But I've sort of been working on it for a few months, sort of moulaging on features one after another as you do. You come home in the evening, and if I happened to feel inspired that day, I would add some random feature to Sire, and I would, or GPU Cubes it was called at the time, which shows you how much I cared about it being a product, right? It was called GPU Cubes VR. I'd come and add some features, and if I felt like it. So that was fun, and then one day I decided to chuck a little gameplay video on Reddit. I did it at 10 p.m. at night, and I sort of linked to the most recent build on my website that no one ever visited, and I went to bed. Next morning, it's the most upvoted post on Reddit, and everyone's saying, this is the best VR experience I've ever seen. And I was really new to sort of operating as a creative online, so this was a mind-blowing prospect to me that people actually liked something that I'd done. And I kind of got one of 3 kind of comments in all these sort of posts. One of them was, "This is really nice, well done," which was nice. The second sort of category was feature requests. You should add this, and you should add this, and I tried it, and my girlfriend said you should add this, and I asked my dog, and he said that you've got to have, and then the third and most common sort of comment in this stuff was, "When's it going to be on Steam? I paid money for this. You should put it on Steam, and you'll become a millionaire." Which I sort of quickly realized, yes, I can become super wealthy, and I can sell. Even if I sold 2,000 copies, that's more money than I've ever had in my bank account in my entire life. So I resolved to release sort of what was previously a sort of a free, fun prototype as a product on Steam, and thus began my horrible descent into madness, which will be represented by this character in the middle of the screen as we go. So what I did was I told everybody in the Reddit thread, okay, yep, it's going to happen. I'm going to release the app on this date. I'm going to add everybody's features, and I sort of made myself this plan, went to rebuild the whole app from scratch. And my intention was all the features that everyone had said, plus now that I know a bit more about how the app was built in the first place, I can combine these and make the app that everyone wants and sell it on Steam for a couple of dollars and make lots of money, and it'll be amazing. And so I sort of went and started this process. And the initial part of it was really fun, adding all the sort of initial features that I wanted to add, and doing the work that was kind of felt a bit too time-consuming to do back when it was a fun evening project. And this was still a sort of evening or weekend project at this point. And that was going really well. The release date that I'd planned sort of came and went, and I hadn't quite got it finished yet, but that was okay. Things take longer than you expect. And what I was really having trouble with was sort of the Steam bureaucracy of making an app and putting in the tax forms for Australia to US, monetization stuff. And so I was kind of procrastinating that, and it was taking a bit longer. not a huge deal. The thing about procrastination is you can't do it forever because startup life went from 50 hours a week to 60 hours a week to 70 hours a week and 80 hours a week, and we had this really crazy, super busy period for about 5 months. And this isn't a talk about burnout, but spoiler alert, if you work for 5 months, 80 hours a week, you become depressed and miserable. So I became depressed and miserable and didn't have time to work on sort of Sire, which was what I was going to call the new sort of version of GPU cubes. And so I was happy to procrastinate it because it was kind of like the Steam stuff was annoying. I can work on the startup stuff, and that's all fine. By the time I sort of came out of that busy period, a few things had happened. One of them was some people had seen the original GPU Cubes demo on Reddit and thought it was really cool and decided to make sort of other kind of physics sandboxy games for the Vive, which I was really happy about because I made it because I like that kind of thing. So the fact that people were doing my job for me and making more stuff that I could do was a brilliant thing. But my pride said that I had to be like the original and the best. This is Cosmic Sugar by David Lobser and Chroma Lab by Sean Tan. So I had to be better than those ones because I was original. Otherwise, people would be like, oh, he took longer and released something that was worse. So my pride made me want to be better. And also, I had this sense in my mind at this point that this is like sort of 9 months after the original sort of Reddit fiasco. I had in my mind that if I released the app that was almost ready back sort of 3 months after the Reddit thing that I'd been procrastinating, if I released that version, which was more or less done, people on Reddit would call me on it and be like, this is a 9-month app, but there's only 3 months worth of features in this. What have you been doing? And everyone would sort of like call me on the fact that I hadn't done the work to justify the amount of time that it took. So I felt like what I needed to do was add those features in less time to make it sort of seem like I've been working productively the entire time of that, offset, right? So that was a terrible choice. What I decided was, now that I was sort of 9 months more experienced and had a better idea of what Sire was like, and now that I'd quit the job at Liminal because I was burnt out and miserable, I was going to rebuild the whole thing from scratch and make like Sire 2.0, pretend like that was the one I'd been working on the whole time, and release it and make my millions of dollars. And so I set myself this 1 month ridiculous, Gantt charted timeline of UX testing and user experience and polish and sound effects and all this stuff in 1 month. Surprisingly, I did not get it done in a month. What I did do in a month was add all the fun stuff. Like the first time, I kind of rebuilt the particle emission system and built a new UI system for the Vive and all this stuff. And that was really fun. That was a sort of really fun, rewarding, creative part. And then I found that once you've got a nice system, you've got to go and then do the UX work to make that system a real thing that users can experience. It's one thing to be in the editor in Unity dragging a slider and then hopping into VR and dragging the slider and hopping into VR, and that's really fun. But when you put the app on Steam, people don't have access to that. So how do you allow users to understand what the system can do and interact with it? And then the procrastination started again. So what happened was, I kind of felt like I had this really nice sort of base app, but I started sort of every day I would go to sit down and do the work on Sire, and what was originally the sort of really fun, working in the compute shaders or choosing really fun sound effects became, oh man, now I've got to do all this like necessary work to make the work I've already done like into the app. And so I continued to procrastinate that way. At the same time, what I'd been doing, throughout this period was exhibiting the 1.0 version of Sire at like festivals and stuff. And what was happening was I was seeing that people really liked it. Enough that I felt like it was sort of wrong of me not to like fully release the app. I felt like, because people would, this might have been the festival, the extra things you have at festivals, but people would hug me sort of crying and being like, this is really a meaningful experience to me. This is really beautiful. Thank you so much. And so I felt like if I was to just leave it as an installation-only sort of experience, then I'd be sort of depriving those people of the right to try this thing out. Next, no, back. Oh, it's a spoiler. He becomes triangle too early. So that was the thing. And so what had happened was, I was a freelancer by this point, working on work stuff. And then when I finished working on work, I would go and work on Desire stuff. And what I'd done in my mind was sort of had this split between official work and personal work. And the personal work, if I wasn't working on Sire, I felt kind of guilty. I felt like if I'm not working on Sire, then I should be working on work, right? I've got my sort of personal creative work should be Sire. Otherwise, I'm delaying the launch even more, and it becomes a problem. What that means is, I kind of found myself kind of trapped between feeling like I had to work on Sire, or I would be, what's the word? Not being productive in my spare time, or working on professional work. The other problem was that by this point it's been 18 months or something since the Reddit thing. I felt as though Sire had come to sort of represent this missed opportunity. Like I felt like if I just released the original app and not worried about Steam and released it for free, I would have got all these downloads and all these companies who'd been messaging me at the time would have hired me, and I'd be riding this amazing wave of success. And I had this trajectory in my mind of where I would have been if I just. And so working on Sire would remind me of all this stuff that I sort of missed out on and not managed to do in time. And so it just became like a sort of a stressful thing to do. And also it kind of reminded me of all the burnout stuff. So it became this sort of big trap where, I'd want to work on Sire because otherwise I'm wasting my time, be stressed out if I was working on Sire, and so I'd procrastinate it, and so I'd feel bad about wasting my time. And so this like sort of endless spiral of responsibility and crushing anxiety got worse and worse and worse, and I sort of procrastinated the app constantly. Next. Yep. And so I kind of had become cognizant of this sort of around this time. I sort of had realized the trap that I was in some ways. And the other problem was that because the original GPU Cubes demo was quite popular, I'd made a whole bunch of friends both in Melbourne and internationally. And in my mind, these friends were my friends contingent upon, me releasing Sire. If I didn't release Sire, they'd realize that I was like a fraud and a sham, and they'd stop being my friends and stop talking to me. And so when they'd be like, hey, how's Sire going? The answer is like, oh yeah, it's going really well. It's almost finished. Just got a couple more sort of UX tweaks and bug fixes to do, then it's coming out on Steam for a year. And I felt like I wasn't able to sort of admit to people I knew professionally that it was causing me a lot of anxiety and trouble. But also, like, I couldn't stop because eventually you can't lie like that forever, right? And so I wrote this big blog post, and it was titled "Why Sire Makes Me Sad," and I kind of like talked to myself, because no one reads my blog. I sort of talked to myself about some of this stuff. And in that blog post, I kind of also talked about all the features that I'd added since the original Reddit demo. And as a result of that, I was like, actually, this is not so bad. I feel like if I release this, people will think it's okay. They'll kind of forgive me for the long time delay. Maybe I should just, put this thing in a box, wrap it up, and ship it. So I went and did that, mostly. I began another rewrite of the entire app, and this time I almost finished it. It was, I think at this point, I got to a place where it was maybe 3 or 4 days of like full-time work from being actually finished. But when I was doing about 30 minutes of work a week, because it was so stressful, just to even think about the app, that 3 or 4 days is like a year, right? So about a year goes by again. And the stress is always building because the lateness makes the stress increase. Eventually I decided to do I sort of was feeling really inspired one morning, so I was like, I'm just gonna, that's it, I'm gonna release Sire. So I went and started a new rewrite from scratch. This time I got about 2 hours in, and I sort of 2 hours into this like third rewrite, I realized this whole story kind of played back in my head, and I realized what probably is really obvious to you. And I sort of closed the project and stood up from my computer. I went for this really long, sort of miserable walk in the rain with my hood on. And I realized a whole bunch of stuff, which is sort of the next part of this talk. When I got back from my walk, I posted this big, long, 30-part tweet, basically telling the story that I just told you all. And I officially cancelled Sire, and I open-sourced the GitHub repositories, and I released my half-finished builds that kind of worked on some computers and not other computers. And I kind of just like walked away. And I felt really good about that, even though I felt like I'd failed those sort of imaginary people who sort of deserved to have this amazing experience. Because now that it was out, I realized a whole bunch of stuff about why I was relieved. The first thing I realized was I had completely missed the whole point of why I was working on the original GPU cubes demo in the first place. I kind of want to define a capital letter terms. One is the act of creation, and one is the act of building. I think people in our industry kind of do both, and we love both. In this definition, I think creation is the act of kind of having an idea and making that idea into a real, tangible thing that you can see, and kind of trying new things and seeing how they work. And that's really like this amazing, from 0 to 1, that sort of initial spark of making something from nothing is super addictive, and that's one of the reasons it drives us to do what we do. But the other term is the act of building, which to me is kind of the act of taking the product of that creation and then making it a finished, polished, useful thing that can sort of go out into the world and stand on its own sort of 2 feet. You know, it's one thing for me to go and make this sort of fun particle app and then in my spare time add features to it and not worry about whether it's sort of a self-contained, useful thing. It's a super different thing for me to then go and say, okay, here's my feature list, I've got it all done. Now I need to sort of do the bug fixing, do the bureaucracy, do the sort of hard work of making it into a product, right? That's really a satisfying thing to do, and I love doing that. But what I was doing that at work every day, and I was making Sire originally because I got to just create stuff and not have to worry about the whole process of, you know, the hard sort of second 90%, right? Like the last 10% is another 90%. So when I decided to myself that I wasn't going to work on any more creative projects and work on Sire instead in my spare time, I officially removed the entire space in my life for creativity. You know, now I was building on the clock at work, and I'd come home and I'd be building Sire, and I was never creating anything new. And if I was doing creation, if I was working on some other app, I was feeling really guilty, like I wasn't working on my creativity project, which was Sire. So what I've learned now, you know, since this is, no matter what in my life, at least for me as a creative, I need to have at least one project or activity for me professionally that is exclusively a creativity and doesn't have the burden of needing to become like a built, you know, rounded, finished thing. And since I've been doing that, it makes me really much more satisfied to do that sort of hard building work, because I know that if I get sort of a bit burnt out or worn out from it, I can go and sort of unwind, do some creativity. That's number one. The second thing that I think I messed up really bad was I didn't really trust both my audience and my creative process. And what I mean by that is, when I took all that feedback from Reddit, Sire was in no way a sort of fully rounded creative idea. It was, you know, like literally just like a moulaged, fun sort of project. Moulage is like it's when you make clothing and you sort of like drape the cloth over it and cut it to shape, and like that's the shape of the cloth is. There's less planning, it's more sort of impromptu. So when I went onto Reddit and sort of took all this random feedback from strangers who tried the app for 15 minutes as like gospel, my original sort of creative vision for the app became much less mine, and so became much less inspiring to work on. And I think part of it came from me not having faith in my own ability to create something that people would like. You know, I felt like I needed to take on a whole bunch of feedback from other people to make something that would be like desirable and enjoyable. So what I've since learned is that it's actually okay to have an idea and make that idea at least like sort of reasonably concrete, both with myself and with teams that I'm working on, before we start taking on sort of uninformed creative feedback. That's number two. And number three is I didn't trust my friends. All the sort of new people that I'd met as a result of GPU cubes, and just after that, not necessarily as a result of it, you know, how to put it, like imposter syndrome is a really real thing, right? Like especially in creative industries. And the received wisdom seems to be that you sort of fake it till you make it, right? Like, you know, you hide your vulnerabilities and insecurities and present this really like confident face to the world. And what that means is, A, you get more skillful while it happens, so eventually, hopefully, you become so talented and amazing that by the time you sort of take a second look, you no longer have imposter syndrome because you're so talented and well regarded. And the second thing is that, you know, there is sort of that cognitive benefit of if you tell yourself something, it can kind of make yourself believe it. The problem, though, with fake it till you make it is the next person who enters the industry after you is looking at that sort of like, really confident exterior shell that you're presenting, and they're feeling imposter syndrome, and then they learn to fake it till they make it, and so the person who comes after them feels imposter syndrome. So the whole thing sort of self-perpetuates. And what I learned when I posted that big Reddit thread is, all those friends who I'd made who I respected tremendously and was terrified of disappointing, they all had the exact same experience as me. Everyone goes like, yeah, we've all been there. And that to me was completely mind-blowing. And it also really cuts down my anxiety moving, like, since then, about being open and vulnerable about failings and anxieties and insecurities, because, it is a super universal experience in all sort of creative industries, and all people who do what we do, experience that feeling. And so, my relationships professionally and creatively have been strengthened tremendously as a result of me sort of realizing that vulnerability is okay. And it is okay to sort of mess things up and be open about that. And through that, sort of, we can all. And so I guess what I would like is, as an alternative, solution to imposter syndrome, is to be vulnerable and to be okay with failing, and to show other people that vulnerability so that they feel okay with vulnerability and sort of, I guess, failure. And that way we can all sort of, be less anxious and sort of make things better together. That's the end. Thanks. I was going to say, if you have even a comment or something that you've experienced as opposed to a question, that's also totally fine with me.
Sorry, hey, thanks for the talk. It's very nice to be able to talk about that. My question is, you fell into, an aspect of the imposter syndrome trap, right? And you probably never will fall again into this one. But do you have any thoughts about other ones? Are you going to avoid future ones? And avoid them.
Yeah, totally. For me, the easiest way to avoid it in the future is when I'm feeling anxious about myself or a project that I'm working on, is to just be open about it. I think anxiety it comes from the sort of the fear of the unknown, like how will people respond to my fears, or how will people sort of view me. If I know, because they'll tell me if I'm feeling anxious around people I trust, and they go like, hey, it's okay, then I'm no longer unsure about how they're sort of viewing me, and so my anxiety goes away. And so I think that's the really easy solution to imposter syndrome if you have a strong community, which comes from being vulnerable and open. So the whole thing sort of self-perpetuates and gets better over time if you can just start that cycle of openness, if that makes sense.
Hello.
Hello.
So you talked about having that imposter syndrome, and then that moment where you kind of realized that all of those people you respected were also just faking it. And it's kind of the two sides of the curtain. And I was wondering if you remember the moment when you realized that.
Yeah, totally. It was basically the evening I posted that big long Twitter thread. I was feeling positive about myself, but I was kind of my mindset was, I can go it alone. I don't need people. It's fine if everyone hates me forever. I can just sort of keep creating and be happy with my own sort of stuff. And I was almost in tears when I sort of realized that people forgave me through their shared experience. And it was really a period of a few hours where I was getting these comments after I smashed the tweet button, where everyone says everyone feels imposter syndrome, right? That's a known thing. But it was a really different experience for me to have my particular brand of imposter syndrome validated and sort of recognized as okay. And I guess now I'm just one more voice saying everyone feels imposter syndrome, but I think just the fact that realization came to me as a result of the vulnerability was to me the important sort of realization that it's okay to be vulnerable.